Hi. 新年快乐. Happy New Year. Happy Chinese New Year. It's Chinese New Year Eve. And lots been on my mind since I last spoke and shared to you occurrences from my personal occurrences for events right after the permanent awakening. And that was the baby Buddha. The spiritual innocence, naivete, one could go far as to say, upon awakening, the helplessness, the incredible feeling of aloneness, almost to the point of abandonment, the lack of any heralding of this event as anything spectacular or out of the ordinary, other than the feeling of helplessness and understanding that coming to terms with this took time which the maturation process began. But the unheraldedness of it, the fact that I expected some arena full of Buddhas cheering and welcoming me into their fold, anything other than the incredible aloneness that I experienced. And the passage of time, as with most things, has brought some insights. Beginning with acceptance. This is how I was. And beyond that, not much remains to be said. So I've talked about events leading up to the experience. I've addressed that it was, to say the least, nothing like I had anticipated or expected. Although I was never promised that it would be otherwise. Nevertheless, it didn't help to make the feeling, to make the experience any less unsettling. And the passage of time has brought two responses. And the first is that simply living life as you find it, as it comes to you, enhances our gracefulness. Living in grace comes from appreciating, number one, the fragility and blessing of what it means to be alive, the acceptance that there is so very little within our control. Our impact on the world is minute at best. But it's this growing in grace, this accepting, this embrace of our place in the order of things, our significance is found in the understanding of ordinariness. In the topsy-turvy the world we find ourselves in, to be ordinary almost contravenes everything that life seems to have been pushing us towards. Certainly, the egoic state cannot, will not, and has not ever been satisfied with acceptance of ordinariness. But it's within grace that you find the beauty, that you really understand how extraordinary, how extraordinary it is to be ordinary. This is a gift of grace, living life gracefully. And the importance, the significance of our ordinariness, the attainment of the ordinary, which is the realization of the universal, unending beauty of our existence, of our state of existence, which is oneness and wholeness. All this lies in the realm of ordinariness. And the acceptance of the attainment of ordinariness is hard to grasp until you see the perfection. You feel the banishment of separation and division. So living life in a state of continuing grace is part of what happened to me after abiding awakening, after dealing with the abandonment and loneliness, after seeing that it could be no other way. And it was the acceptance of this that grace came to be me. So this state of grace this embracing of ordinariness, which comes close on the heels of recognizing the spiritual ego and banning it. So there's no remnants of this spiritual ego, this insidious big brother of our ordinary egoic self. Hallmarks of the spiritual ego is that judgment still exists. There's no place in grace, in graceful living, for judgment. There's no place in living in the moment for judgment. And judgment has many guises. So that feeling that I experienced, my first impulse was to share, to let others know. But if I look at this closely, two things. Number one, I had accomplished something. Well, how can being what you always have been be any sort of accomplishment? Perhaps the realization that you always have been, always will be, and are the perfect expression of the universal. So perhaps the realization of this is of some consequence. But if it leads to any kind of judgment, if you feel like you've accomplished something that separates you from the rest, that makes you somehow superior or better, well, grace, living in a state of grace, will elude you. As you defeat this not insignificant foe, the spiritual ego, as you understand the beauty in the ordinary, more than understand, you embrace it. You become the ordinary. This is a state of grace. Grace is full of wonder and awe and thankfulness and alertness. Grace will lead you where you were destined to go. And grace will start to living in grace. Because to live in grace means the abandonment of all the petty quirks of our existence. This grace becomes what I call radiant consciousness. And that's the name of today's sharing. Radiant consciousness. It springs from grace. One thing leads to another. And living in grace is pretty much a personal, private choice. You can't seek it. You can't pursue it. What you can do is create a fertile ground and from which it can grow, flower, and blossom. And consciousness is gifted through grace. No outside observer can watch you, can listen to you, and truly know that you're living in a state of grace. This state exists between our ears, in our heart. Nothing that comes from our mouth, nothing that comes from our actions are conclusive proof that we are indeed in this state, the state of continual, constant grace. But the fruit of this is radiant consciousness. Not all life is consciousness. In fact, life means consciousness. There's conscious, subconscious, unconscious. But nevertheless, no matter how we label it, this consciousness is synonymous with life. So unlike state of grace, there really is no state of consciousness, simply because just by breathing in and out, we've accomplished consciousness. Even when we're unconscious, unless we're dead, some consciousness remains. So I differentiate grace comes through. Understanding the beauty of the ordinary, where there's no striving, there's no search, there's just simple act of being. What could be more basic? So people don't know. And it's okay, because as soon as I went out proclaiming to anyone that I live in a state of grace, even as I'm doing in this video, I encourage you to doubt. Doubt everything is healthy. Examine, evaluate, experiment. But the reason I'm talking about being in the state of grace is the flower, the fruit is radiant consciousness. Finally, there's something occurring within us that can have, does have, and will have an impact on all of those around us. This is when you can simply go shopping, when you can simply participate in the world as you find it, and more importantly, as it finds you. Radiant means to radiate, to send out, much as our sun sends out heat, energy, and light. So too does the radiant consciousness send out all three, with the addition of healing and comforting. Simply by going in a room, those around you feel better. And the beauty of this is anonymity, to be an anonymous source. Over time, perhaps, people will begin to sense on some level, maybe even recognize that this radiant energy that's emanating from your being, it might get noticed at some point. And that's when maybe some people will begin to seek your advice, to seek your guidance, even as they've already embraced your presence. Now, as in every thing, responsibility abides. Even as living in grace is effortless, so too is the radiance of your consciousness. I always heard of the last temptation of Christ. I've felt the last temptations of Buddha. I felt the last temptations of myself. And for me, this was wrapped in the spiritual ego. Letting go, recognizing the falseness, recognizing the Maya, the illusion, even though it's couched in more constructive, more positive language, does not make the construct any less so. In fact, it makes it more insidiously dangerous. And if you're blessed on your journey that once you awaken, there are no temptations. No temptations to share. No temptations to feel better. To feel that you've accomplished some tremendous deed. In fact, that's very humorous to me, because you've accomplished the very ordinary understanding of who and what you are. Do you need accolades? Do you need admiration? Appreciation? Should be and is all meaningless. So I talked about responsibility. If your radiant consciousness is recognized by others, it warrants a smile. And that's about it. Again, it's not special, except that through this radiant consciousness, you begin to position yourself to have more impact. Impact in a positive sense, that in your ordinary, small way, you can make the world a little bit better for those around you. And remember, this is not an accomplishment. This is result, plain and simple, of living in grace. This is the consequence of living in grace. This radiant consciousness, unlike grace, can be noticed by those on the outside. But it's a vague kind of noticing. Somehow they feel slightly better in your presence. And this kind of accounts for the Guru when he has masses of people who are feeling even small, minute amounts of awareness of your radiant consciousness together in a group. Groups magnify for the good and for the worse. Mob, group to mob. But this carries a responsibility. And the responsibility is to understand your limitations. None of us, not one of us, can awaken another. Only each and every one of us can awaken ourselves, can experience awakening. So understanding that no matter if you have 1 or 2 or 10,000 or 100,000 followers who are basking in your radiant consciousness, all you can do is smile. Words cease to have any purpose. Words are only intended as a signpost, a vague way of sharing your experience. Road signs, they point the way. Awakening, straight ahead, or back there, or over there. So, humility, humbleness are all parts of ordinariness. They come in the territory. So you point and share. And with the understanding there will come a time when you step back, where your presence is no longer conducive to the individual's journey from non-permanent to permanent awakening. Smile, be loving, and radiate your consciousness.